what happens if you take a traditional log cabin quilt block, but add a bunch of little squares? You'll end up with a Cornerstone Log Cabin. Today, I'm going to show you how to make it. Welcome to Epida Studio. My name is Elizabeth and I help you make beautiful things with quilting, pojagi, and embroidery. So a Cornerstone Log Cabin quilt block is kind of like a traditional quilt block, but it does have these extra squares in the corner. So that just really adds interest to the block. And when you use a bunch of these blocks together, it can give you some really interesting secondary designs. So you're going to need 3 fabrics for this block. So I'm making this one in greens and I'm going to make a 9-inch square block. So get your fabric ready and make one along with me. So to make the Cornerstone Log Cabin, we need 3 fabrics, and 1 fabric is going to be for the center and the cornerstones, and then 1 fabric for one corner and another fabric for the other corner. So I'm using light and darks for the corners or the bars and a medium fabric for the center and the cornerstones. So I have this green print that I'm using. So for the center square, you're gonna need a 3.5-inch square, and then you're gonna need 12 1.5-inch squares for the cornerstones. And then for the bars that go on the sides to make the corners of the block, from each fabric, I'm using this light kind of beige and then this dark green. From each of those, you're going to need 2 1.5-inch by 3.5-inch, 2 1.5 by 5.5, and 2 1.5 by 7.5. So it's a lot of little pieces in this block, but it goes together pretty easily. So what we're going to do, we're going to start off by adding our cornerstones to our bars, and pick one of your colors. It doesn't really matter which one, so I'll just pick the lighter color. And so we'll start with that. So on the first one, so I have 4 1.5 by 3.5-inch bars. So on the first light one, I am not going to add anything to that. And then on the second one, I'm going to add 1 of our little cornerstone squares onto the edge of that bar like that. And then on the first of the other color, so this green one, I'm going to add 1 square onto that. And unless you're using something with a directional print, it doesn't really matter which end you use it on because you can turn it around. So we'll add the cornerstone onto there. And then on the last strip of the color, I'm going to add a cornerstone onto both ends of that. And so we're going to do that the same with all of our strips. So this is our 3.5. We'll do the same thing with 5.5 and the 7.5. We'll go through, and on one of the strips, you'll add 0 cornerstones, then 1, 1, and then 2 cornerstones on the last one. It doesn't really matter which ones you pick, but one of them is going to have 0 and one of them is going to have 2. So that's our first step, and then we can go into assembling the block. So once those cornerstones have been sewn on, we're going to press those towards the cornerstone, so away from the bar. And then we can see this block is built just like a traditional log cabin. So we start with our center square, and then we're going to add the bars around the side of it. So we're starting with the 3.5-inch strips. So we'll put our 1 on one side, and then the next 3.5-inch strip will go on this side, and we can see the cornerstone is matching to the other bar. And then our next one will be the dark bar with 1 cornerstone, and then the last side is going to be the one with 2 cornerstones. So just like a log cabin, we'll add them in that order. So I'm going to add the first row on and show you what it looks like, and then we can just continue building the block from there. So now that we have our first round of pieces on, this is going to be 5.5 inches square. And if you're having a hard time getting an exact seam allowance, you can check out my other video that will give you some tips on how to get a more accurate seam allowance. But we can see now we can just add our next row. And so I have my beige piece that has no cornerstones, beige with one cornerstone. And so this cornerstone goes in the corner, and then green with one cornerstone and green with 2 cornerstones. So I'm going to add those on, and then my piece will be 7.5 inches square, and then I'll repeat the whole process. I'll put in my last bar, and then white with the cornerstone, green with the cornerstone, and then the double cornerstone. So we can see how it is looking like a log cabin, but there are cornerstones on the block. So I'm going to assemble that and show you the finished block. So here is the finished block, and we can see it's just a fun variation of a traditional log cabin block. Now this block is 9.5 inches square, so it will finish at 9 inches. But of course, if you wanted to make it bigger, you could just keep adding more and more rows until you got to the size that you wanted. So no problem at all, it's really adjustable. So I hope you enjoyed this block. If you want to see more quilt blocks and other quilting tutorials, you can find that here on my channel or at my website, epidastudio.com.